What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The first time anyone told me about the Kokeshi cursed doll of northern Japan, they did not call it a curse. They called it a memory, a sorrow, a vessel of grief carved into wood. To the villagers who whispered of it, the doll was not simply an object, it was a doorway between the warmth of the living and the silence of the dead, between tender remembrance and chilling obsession. That began, as all ghost stories do, with love. The mountains of the Tōhoku region have always held onto silence like a secret. Winters fall there with teeth of ice, and the snow buries villages so deeply that time itself seems to freeze. Families in those isolated lands passed long months by firelight, their breath rising in visible clouds as they shared food, stories, and warmth. It was in these mountains that the Kokeshi doll was born, not as a toy, but as a prayer, a talisman against sickness, hunger, and death, carved from slender pieces of cherry or dogwood. Kokeshi dolls were stripped of limbs, reduced to form's simplest essence, a cylindrical body, smooth as a river stone, crowned with a round head. Onto this surface, artisans painted delicate strokes: 2 eyes, a mouth, faint lines of hair. Each stroke carried meaning, each line carried a wish. They were often given to children, but more often, they were given to the spirits of children who never lived long enough to grow. The Kokeshi, in its quiet stillness, became a surrogate for memory. But what happens when memory refuses to remain a comfort? What happens when grief feeds upon itself, and love, desperate and unyielding, calls something back from beyond? The story of the cursed Kokeshi doll begins in the late years of the Meiji era, around the turn of the 20th century. In a nameless village deep in the snowy ridges of Tōhoku, a child died too soon. She was 7 years old, fragile, radiant, with laughter that echoed like bells across frozen fields. Her death was sudden, a fever that struck in the night and left her parents hollow by morning. Her father, an artisan, carved a Kokeshi doll to honor her. He worked not with hands alone but with trembling, grief-stricken soul. He carved not a toy, but a reliquary for her spirit. The villagers whispered that, as he painted her hair, he wept onto the wood, and the tears sank into its grain like offerings. He painted her smile the way he remembered it, subtle, not too wide, as though she was about to whisper a secret. When the doll was finished, it looked too alive, too much like the girl who was gone. He placed it before the family altar, lit incense, and prayed that his daughter's soul would not wander lost through the snow. For a time, the doll seemed to soothe him. He would speak to it each night, whispering stories, telling it about the day. His wife would sometimes hear him weeping as he cradled it against his chest. But then strange things began. The doll, though carved with painted hair, seemed to change. The black strokes that represented strands of hair darkened, thickened. One morning, his wife awoke to find a thin strand of actual hair, black, human, unmistakable, lying across the doll's forehead. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence. Perhaps a hair had fallen from her own head, but then more came. Day by day, the strands grew longer. The doll's head, once smooth, now bore locks of hair that seemed to sprout from within the wood itself. And then came the whispering. At night, when snow howled against their shutters, the parents would hear it, a child's voice, faint, calling from the shadows. Sometimes the doll's smile seemed wider in the flicker of the fire. Sometimes her painted eyes glistened as though damp with tears. Guests who visited the house swore they felt small footsteps pattering across the tatami mats. When no child was present, the villagers began to avoid the home. Some said the parents had anchored their child's spirit into the doll. Others said they had trapped something else entirely, something that wore the girl's voice like a mask. The family, torn between fear and devotion, refused to abandon the doll. To them, it was their daughter. To them, it was love. But love, when twisted by grief, can become a haunting. When the parents eventually died, the doll was passed to a temple, where monks kept it hidden. They trimmed its hair, but it continued to grow. Even today, whispers claim it still rests there, its locks thick and black, its smile faint but alive. Visitors who dare approach it report feeling watched, as though a child's gaze peers from behind its painted eyes. This is the legend of the Kokeshi cursed doll. Yet, it is not merely a single tale. It is a symbol, an echo of something far larger. Across the world, Dolls have always occupied the uncanny valley between life and lifelessness. They are human, but not human. They stare, but they do not blink. They smile, but they do not breathe. For as long as people have carved faces into wood or porcelain, they have also whispered that such faces can hold spirits. The Kokeshi is Japan's contribution to this eternal dread. But the Kokeshi cursed doll is not just another haunted object. It is not a malice-bound trinket like the voodoo figures of the Caribbean, nor a prison of demons like Annabelle in the West. Its horror is subtler, deeper. It is the horror of grief that refuses to die. It is the terror of love so strong it corrupts itself. The doll is not a monster. The doll is a mirror dot. To understand it, we must journey deeper, not just into the snowy mountains of Japan, but into the very heart of ghost stories themselves. Ghosts, after all, are not about the dead. They are about the living. They are about what we cannot let go of, what we fear to forget, what we secretly hope still lingers in the silence. And so the story begins. It begins with a village. It begins with a father's hands trembling over wood. It begins with hair sprouting where there should be none. It begins with whispers in the night. It begins with a doll that is not merely wood and paint, a doll that holds something, a doll that waits. And if you listen closely, you may hear it too. A faint voice, the giggle of a child carried on the breath of wind, a laughter that should have ended long ago. The story of the Kokeshi cursed doll is not simply a tale to frighten. It is a tale to unsettle, to remind you that love is not always kind, that memory is not always safe, and that sometimes the things we cling to most dearly are the very things that haunt us. For in Japan, among mountains draped in silence, there waits a doll whose hair still grows, whose eyes still gleam, whose spirit still whispers. And this is only the beginning. It began as sorrow, it grew into silence, and then, like the frost that creeps down from mountain ridges, it became something else entirely, an unseen presence, the kind that wraps around a house and turns every corner into a threshold, every shadow into a mouth waiting to speak. The Kokeshi doll was no longer just a vessel of grief, it had become a vessel of something greater. The first monk who accepted the doll into the temple did not believe in curses. He was a man of faith and discipline, hardened by years of austerity, and he believed that spirits could be soothed with ritual, prayers, and incense. He placed the doll on the altar of lesser relics, where offerings were left for wandering souls. Each night he burned incense before it, chanting sutras meant to guide the restless toward enlightenment. For weeks, he thought little of it, but then he began to dream. In the first dream, he stood in a snow-covered field, alone. The wind howled, and yet faintly, beneath the storm, he heard laughter high, childlike, and piercing in its clarity. He turned, but the field was empty. Still, he felt tugging at the hem of his robe, small fingers clutching fabric. When he awoke, his sleeve was torn, though no sharp object had touched it. The second dream came with the scent of incense. He dreamed of the temple halls, but they were darker than they should have been. The flickering lanterns cast strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move even when the flames were still. In the dream, he approached the altar where the doll sat. Its eyes, painted though they were, glistened like wet pearls. Its smile was wider than before. And then, with agonizing slowness, its head tilted not as wood should tilt, stiff and mechanical, but as flesh does, supple and deliberate. He woke with sweat running down his back, chanting sutras to steady his trembling hands. By the third dream, he no longer denied the truth. Something lived within the doll, and he was not the only one. Other monks began to feel the unease. A coldness lingered in the temple halls, a chill that no brazier could dispel. Visitors brought offerings, and some swore they saw the doll blink. Others claimed that when they bowed before the altar, they heard footsteps padding just behind them, though no one stood there. A woman who visited with her child reported hearing faint giggles echoing in the rafters. Though the temple was nearly empty, it became clear the spirit tethered to the doll was not at rest. But what was it? Was it the girl herself, her soul refusing to leave the warmth of her parents' memory, clinging to the doll as to a body reborn? Or was it something else? Some yokai masquerading as innocence, feeding upon grief like a parasite? The monks could not agree. Some believed it was the child, trapped in liminality, bound to the wood by the intensity of her parents' love and sorrow. Others whispered darker things, that in pouring so much grief into the carving, the father had not called his daughter back, but had instead invited something hungry, something that wore her voice like a mask. Whatever it was, the doll's hair kept growing, and there was no natural explanation for it. Priests trimmed it regularly, but within weeks, the strands returned, thick and black, coarse as human hair. Experts who examined it decades later confirmed that it was real human hair, though how it grew from carved wood remained an impossibility. Some believed the father had embedded strands within the doll, and they somehow spread. Others claimed fraud, though the monks, sworn to truth, denied any deception. The hair grew because the spirit was still alive within. That was the only explanation that carried weight in the silence of the temple. Halls, but hair was not the only sign. There were voices, sometimes a cry, as though a child wailing from the darkness of an unseen room. Sometimes laughter, as brittle as frost cracking beneath a boot. Sometimes, late at night, monks would hear chanting not their own sutras, but the sing-song voice of a girl humming lullabies. No one remembered teaching her. One monk reported waking in the dead of night to find the doll at the foot of his futon. He had not moved it there. No one else had either. Its smile was faint, but in the moonlight it seemed sharper, as though the painted line curved upward with malice. Another claimed that when he passed by the altar, the doll's head turned ever so slightly to follow him. He told himself it was imagination, yet the next day he found a strand of black hair caught between the pages of his sutra book. The haunting grew bolder with the years. There are stories of travelers who stayed overnight at the temple, only to flee before dawn. One man swore that as he lay trying to sleep, he felt a child climb onto his chest, pressing down until he could barely breathe. When he opened his eyes, he saw nothing but the doll, once across the room, now rested on the mat beside him. Others spoke of dreams bleeding into waking life. They dreamed of children calling their names, of pale faces peeking from sliding doors, of laughter echoing in empty fields. When they awoke, they carried scratches on their skin, tiny but sharp, as though nails had raked them while they slept. Still, the temple could not abandon the doll. They believed to destroy it would be to unleash whatever was bound within. Fire might not purify it, might only release its essence into the air. And so they kept it, trimming its hair, chanting over it, keeping it contained as best they could. But the truth was undeniable. The doll was no longer an object. It was a presence. And presences like these do not simply stay within walls. Whispers began to spread beyond the temple. Travelers carried the tale across villages, across towns, across the length of Japan. The Kokeshi cursed doll became infamous, a symbol of grief transformed into haunting. People came from afar to glimpse it, to test their courage, to dare the unseen. Some left with nothing but unease. Others left with nightmares that followed them for weeks. A few never spoke of what they saw, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. And as the story grew, so too did the haunting. Ghost stories, after all, are not passive. They feed upon belief. Every whisper, every retelling, every shiver of fear breathed new life into the legend. What was once a single doll in a single temple became a myth, woven into Japan's tapestry of yokai and yurei. The Kokeshi cursed doll became a mirror of all dolls across the world, a reminder of how easily memory tips into haunting. Because when we carve a face into wood, when we give it eyes, a smile, a likeness of humanity, we open a door, and sometimes something walks through. And the Kokeshi doll was no longer content to remain within its wooden skin. By the time the 20th century grew old and the modern world began to stretch its fingers into even the remotest corners of Japan, the legend of the Kokeshi cursed doll had already rooted itself deep in folklore. But unlike ordinary folklore, which grows fainter with time, this legend only grew sharper, louder, more demanding. For the spirit within the doll had fed upon a century of whispers, and now, it seemed, whispers were no longer enough. The monks who had kept the doll all those years began to wither under its presence. Their faces grew haggard, their eyes sunken, as though each night stripped another layer of their strength. Visitors who once came out of curiosity now came out of desperation. Parents whose children had fallen ill, widows who longed for contact with their lost husbands, wanderers who sought proof that the invisible world was real. They brought offerings, begged the doll for blessings, touched its wooden skin as though it were a relic, and sometimes, they claimed, the doll answered. A mother swore her child's fever broke the night after she prayed to it. A man claimed he dreamed of his late wife smiling and waving after whispering her name to the doll. A young girl insisted the doll had blinked at her, once, just once, and though she fled screaming, she later recovered from an illness that doctors had deemed fatal. But blessings and curses are two faces of the same coin, and the doll's favor came with a shadow. For every story of healing, there was another of ruin. A visitor who mocked the doll on his way out of the temple was found dead within a week, his body discovered in the forest, twisted, his face locked in a grimace of terror. A group of travelers who dared to take a photograph of the doll found the image, corrupted. Her painted smile stretched far too wide, her eyes glimmering with unnatural light. One of them went mad not long after, speaking only of the little girl in the corners of the room. The monks were no longer certain if they were guardians or prisoners. The doll's presence expanded beyond the altar, beyond the walls of the temple, into dreams, into thoughts, into the very air around them. And though they trimmed her hair, it only grew thicker, darker, glossier, as though each strand was fed by the prayers, the fears, the desperate love poured into her. The climax of her haunting came during the storm of 1963. It was a night when the mountains howled with winds strong enough to topple trees. Snow fell in sheets, so heavy the temple doors groaned under its weight. The monks huddled in prayer, for they had felt unease growing for weeks. Whispers in the rafters, objects moving on their own, and the doll's smile shifting as though it lived. That night, the unease became terror. The head monk awoke to the sound of laughter, childlike, echoing through the corridors. He rose, clutching his beads, and made his way toward the altar. But the doll was gone. The monks searched, lanterns swaying, the storm battering the wooden walls. They followed the sound of small footsteps that seemed to run just ahead of them, always out of reach. Doors slid open without touch, shadows shifted without form. The temple filled with the scent of incense and damp earth, though no incense burned. Finally, in the main hall, they saw her. The doll sat in the center of the tatami floor, though no one had placed it there. Her hair, long and black, pooled around her like a cloak, and her head was no longer still. It turned slowly, as though acknowledging each monk in turn. Her painted eyes gleamed in the lantern light, wet, alive. One monk collapsed, weeping. Another whispered that he saw not a doll, but a child sitting there, pale and thin, her mouth opening in silent laughter. The head monk fell to his knees, chanting sutras as loudly as his trembling voice could manage. And then, the hall grew colder. Breath steamed in the air. The lanterns flickered, sputtered, died. In the darkness, the laughter became louder, layered, no longer the voice of a single child, but of many dozens. Hundreds, an army of voices overlapping in a cacophony of mirth and grief. The monks pressed their faces to the floor, desperate to survive the night. They prayed until their throats were raw, until the storm outside faded, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the paper walls. And when dawn came, the doll was back on the altar, as if it had never moved. But her hair was longer than ever, spilling down to the floor. And her smile had changed, no longer faint, no longer subtle. It was wide now, stretched to the edges of her face. From that day forward, the monks no longer called her a relic. They called her a prison of grief, yes, but also of something far older, far hungrier. Perhaps the child's spirit lingered within, but she was no longer alone. The doll had become a vessel, and vessels do not choose what fills them. Reports spread quickly after the storm. Travelers who visited the temple swore the doll's presence was unbearable, that even the bravest among them could not meet her gaze for long. Some said she whispered in their ears, promising things they dared not repeat. Others claimed she followed them home, appearing in dreams, standing at the foot of their beds. The legend of the Kokeshi cursed doll had reached its peak. No longer just a tale of grief, it was now a tale of fear itself, a story whispered in classrooms, in tea houses, in alleyways where lanterns swung like fragile moons. Children dared each other to say her name, to carve their own dolls and wait for whispers in the night. Parents warned them not to play such games, but curiosity is its own curse, and many ignored the warnings. And always, the doll remained in her temple, hair trimmed, smile painted, presence growing. By now, she was not merely a doll. She was a shrine of sorrow, a cathedral of whispers, a reminder that the boundary between love and haunting is thinner than snow on the wind. And still, she waits. The air inside the shrine had grown heavier since that night, when the fire had licked the walls but failed to consume the doll. It was as though the very air, the very particles suspended in the silence, were no longer air at all, but fragments of someone else's breath. The villagers had rebuilt what was burned, but they avoided the inner chamber, as if it no longer belonged to them, as if it were carved out of the earth for another purpose altogether. The Kokeshi remained there, blackened in some places, yet unbroken, sitting with its fixed painted eyes that seemed, more than ever, to drink in the world around it. Akiko had returned, against her will, against the counsel of every villager who had begged her to leave the valley forever. She had come back. She claimed she dreamed of it nightly, that the doll whispered to her across the distance, across miles, across sleep. Her health had withered since she left. She grew pale, thin, and restless. Doctors said her blood was fine, her organs intact, but she woke each dawn with the same words falling from her lips, in a voice not her own. "I am not finished." Her grandmother, frail and trembling, had tried to shield her, to pull her away, but Akiko was bound now, bound in a way no cord or knot could sever. She stood before the shrine once more, staring at its scarred door, her heart hollow and yet thrumming. Behind her, the mist clung to the mountain path like fingers reaching, and before her, inside, she could feel it waiting, the ghost within, the endless hunger of its silence. The priest who once guided them was gone. Some said he left the valley in shame, unable to bear what his rituals had failed to quell. Others said he had been swallowed by the mountain itself, taken during one of his midnight prayers when the shadows gathered to thick. Only his sandals remained, neatly placed by the riverbank, as if he had stepped out of the world. No priest came to replace him. No blessing had been spoken on this ground since, and so Akiko entered alone. The shrine groaned as the door slid open. Wood swollen by age and soot, dust stirred like spirits loosed, dancing in a narrow beam of moonlight that cut across the chamber. The doll sat at the center, its head cocked as though listening. The char on its lacquered body glistened faintly, and its painted mouth, still nothing but a curved line, seemed wider now. "Why do you keep calling me?" Akiko whispered, her voice cracking, her hands trembling at her sides. For a long moment, nothing. Then the air rippled just a fraction, like heat waves over stone, and she heard it, not with her ears, but with her bones. "Because you carried me, because you awakened me, because now we are bound." Akiko staggered back, her nails scraping against the doorframe, but her feet refused to leave. Her body, her soul, betrayed her. Something inside her chest answered the doll, not in words but in a pull, like tides toward the moon. "You are a curse," she managed, her teeth clenched, her body rigid against the unseen force. "You are a shadow made to torment." Again, that ripple through the chamber, a low resonance. "No. I am what you made when you gave me shape. I am what they made when they poured their grief into wood and paint. I am not torment, I am remembrance. I am the wound that refuses to heal." Akiko's breath came fast. She remembered dimly the old stories her grandmother told, the origin of the Kokeshi, carved from wood to comfort those who lost their children, small dolls to hold in shaking hands where no child remained to hold. But somewhere along the way, grief curdled into something else. The dolls ceased to be vessels of mourning and became vessels of persistence, of unfinished souls. Perhaps this one had been carved too well. Perhaps the artisan had poured too much of his heart, too much of his despair, into its grain. Perhaps he had carved not wood, but a prison. "Then let go," Akiko whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "Let go of this place, of this sorrow." The doll did not move, but the silence sharpened until it was a scream without sound. "Do you let go of your grief, Akiko? Do you let go of the face you see when you close your eyes, the face of the child who might have been, had fate not cut short? No, you hold it, you cradle it." "As I cradle mine," Akiko's knees buckled, and she fell forward, her hands brushing the stone floor. The truth clawed at her chest. She had always longed, always ached, for what she could never name, a shadow of someone not born, a hollow in her heart that no love filled. She had not known it fully until now. The doll had known. The doll had fed. Her scream broke then, ragged, raw, as if it tore through years of silence. The candle stubs in the chamber flared though none were lit. Shadows writhed along the walls. The Kokeshi trembled on its stand, and then it moved. The sound was faint but unmistakable, wood shifting against wood. Its head turned, slowly, purposefully, those painted eyes fixed on her, and in them she saw not ink, not pigment, but depth, a depth like the mouth of a well, drawing her in. She felt herself sliding, her mind tilting toward that abyss. The voice filled her again, louder, clearer. "You will carry me out of this shrine, into the world that forgot me. Together, we will remind them. Her body rose against her will, her hands reaching, trembling, until they closed around the small, blackened form. The wood was cold, so cold it burned. She gasped as the chill spread into her veins, into her marrow, into her breath. For a moment, she thought she heard children laughing, hundreds of them, their voices overlapping in a chorus that spiraled into shrieks. Then silence again, heavy and complete. When she stepped out of the shrine, the moonlight struck her face, and for a flicker of an instant, it was not her face at all but another's, a pale child with hollow eyes and a painted mouth. Then it was gone, and only Akiko remained, clutching the doll to her chest, her eyes distant, her lips trembling with words she did not speak aloud. The villagers watched from afar, hidden in the mist. None dared approach. They whispered that night of what they saw, how her shadow stretched longer than her body, how the mist recoiled around her form, how the air bent and warped in her wake. She walked the path down the mountain slowly, steadily, and no one stopped her. The shrine door closed on its own. Days passed, and then weeks. Reports trickled in from neighboring towns. A woman with haunted eyes carrying a blackened doll seen in marketplaces, on trains, at shrines, lights flickering when she passed, children waking from sleep, screaming though their parents heard no sound, and always, always, whispers of laughter in places where no child stood. Akiko was becoming less herself, or perhaps more. Her letters when she sent them were written in a strange, old-fashioned script, words twisted into riddles. She spoke of rivers that ran with memories, of dolls that breathed in the night, of doors between worlds cracking open. Her grandmother wept over each letter, pressing them to her chest as if they were farewells from a daughter already gone. And still, the Kokeshi endured, never broken, never burned. It is said even now that somewhere in Japan, if you find yourself alone on a train past midnight, you may see a woman seated at the far end of the carriage, holding a small, blackened doll. She will not look at you, not directly, but if you catch her reflection in the window, the doll's painted eyes will seem to blink. And if you are foolish enough to stare too long, you may find your stop has passed, and the train rolls on into darkness. No stations, no lights, no end. No one who has ridden that train until dawn has ever returned unchanged. Some vanish entirely, some come back pale, silent, carrying a doll of their own, and some wake each morning with the same words slipping from their lips. I am not finished. The story does not end. It lingers, as grief lingers, as shadows linger. The Kokeshi doll does not sleep. It waits. Always it waits, for the next hand to hold it, the next soul to mirror its sorrow, the next life to unravel into its endless remembrance. And so, when you hear laughter where no children play, when you see a painted face in the grain of wood, when you wake with cold in your bones and a name not yours on your tongue, ask yourself, is it truly only you in the room, or has the Kokeshi found you too? The shrine stands empty, the mountain mist still clinging, but the curse walks among us now. It does not fade, it does not forgive. It waits, painted smile unbroken. And you, reader, who carried this story into your mind, who let its voice settle into your thoughts, you are now part of it. Perhaps one night, when the air grows colder than it should, when laughter threads through your dreams, you will wake to find a small wooden doll at your bedside. And when you do, remember this: the ghost of the Kokeshi cursed doll does not come to be believed. It comes to be carried,